You know, I think this movie takes the prize so far. Not for writing or directing necessarily, or acting, although I think in all those areas it scores higher than most of the rock and roll movies I've gotten into, am covering, have covered, and will cover. So it's still a strong contender for those. But the clearest award it gets so far, besides an honorable mention for, I believe, not featuring a scene in which someone steps up to a microphone and it feeds back for no good reason. Although I'll have to give it one more rewatch to be absolutely sure. And it's also not a surefire winner for the prize of filmed band looking like they're actually playing effect, which it can technically win because of Soundgarden and Alice in Chains actually portraying themselves as they would on stage to a live track of one of their own songs, not a recorded version from an album, which is extra points there. No, that award has to go to a group of actors portraying a band they're not actually in. And so far in my research, that's going to go to the film Backbeat from 1994, 5, somewhere in there, that portrays the Hamburg-era Beatles as the pilled up, screaming, trying to do their best imitation of Little Richard joke machines that they were back then. Now, this film wins the made in the 80s or later, so think ahead to other 90s, maybe romantic comedies or comedies, outright wacky comedies that had bands in them, and on in the early 2000s, all the way up to, let's say, the Ghostbusters soft reboot that had a heavy metal rock concert scene in it. This movie gets the prize for film made in the 80s or later that does not portray rock fans at rock shows as brain-dead gum chewers looking at the ceiling with their mouths open, or alternately wild jungle people who are either to be feared or laughed at. The scenes in rock clubs actually portray a scene in a rock club. People look like people. They look like the sort of segment of humanity that you would typically see at a rock club. I don't know how to say it otherwise, because it's not like some of the punk movies we're doing where there is either an attempt to portray punk crowds as vicious and dangerous in a very disingenuous way, or try to portray the sillier aspects of a punk show crowd, let's say, or punk show performance, like in Repo Man, where it's funny and fun and silly, or an attempt to cast an actual, group of punk rockers seeing an actual punk band that really exists, like you'll see in Suburbia. And when I say Suburbia, I am, of course, referring to the 1983 Roger Corman and Penelope Spheeris film. Not Suburbia, just the place that you end up driving around when you're leaving the city. Now, for singles, we have a lot to talk about. We're going to start with the career of Cameron Crowe up to this point. This is a guy who's in love with rock and roll and has been his whole life. He starts out as a teenage journalist for Cream Magazine and Rolling Stone, basically annoying people like Lester Bangs and Jan Wenner until they give up and give him assignments. We'll definitely be covering what I might think of as his magnum opus with Almost Famous later. That movie was basically an adaptation of his real life experiences on the road with Zeppelin or Allman Brothers and The Who, turned into sort of a fictionalized mishmash of one band that was made up. But it wasn't the first time he made up a band for his own uses in a film. No. We've got Citizen Dick in this movie, fronted by Cliff Pontier, who at one point is actually interviewed by Cameron Crowe himself, acting as a rock journalist with a tape recorder. Very, very, very funny now to watch. I didn't realize that was him a long time ago. No wonder he plays himself so well. He does the perfect moment that the rock journalists do when they have the microphone in their hand and the subject is in between statements and they sort of make a little utterance, like, and then they put the mic in front of the guy's face and they put it back in their face and then move back and forth. Expert timing. Cliff Pontier is played by Matt Dillon, of course, an actor who'd had quite a career up to this point, and not unqualified for hanging out with musicians as he would in this film. His fake band is populated with members of who, well, at that time were Mookie Blaylock and would become Pearl Jam. Stone Gossard, Jeff Ament, and Eddie Vedder on drums. A compliment for us is a compliment for you. If you haven't seen the film yet, you'll get that later. Anyways, he'd actually been in a video for the Pogues. Fairy Tale of New York. He plays a New York cop that basically knocks Shane MacGowan around and almost throws him down the stairs. And he hung out with him. Did his share of partying with them. There's a great BBC documentary about the making of Fairy Tale of New York, and he's interviewed for it. It's a lot of fun. Anyways, just saying he's not without some credibility when it comes to hanging out with rock and rollers. So Cameron Crowe, after he's, done on the road with various bands and writing for rock magazines, decides to write a novel. And to write this novel, he actually enrolls his adult self in a San Diego high school and basically makes friends, goes to classes undercover with the full support of the superintendent and the principal and the teachers. Actually, I take it back. I don't know if the teachers were all in on it until they found out later. I'm not sure. I know the students didn't know until he came up at graduation and gave a speech and let them know that this kid that looked like one of them was actually an adult that just happened to look very small and very young for his age. A lot of times he would excuse himself to go to the bathroom while really interesting conversations were taking place with his friends so he could write those specifics down in his notebook, which is why the novel and the eventual movie adaptation, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, would strike such a nerve, strike such a chord with 80s audiences. It seemed very real and very raw. And I think, like a lot of Cameron Crowe films, to me, it tries to straddle this balance between wholesome and uncynical while still being unflinching when it comes to people's pain and personal relationship tragedies and things like that. For me, it's a little tough sometimes. I get knocked around a bit by it, especially with this movie. But then again, I was a teenager when this movie came out, and after a couple of bad breakups, I didn't like watching it so much anymore. But there's always these like funny quips and really interesting supporting characters in the ensembles of a lot of his films that provide the comic relief, and they get to the edge of being a little too witty sometimes to be believable, while sometimes the main characters in singles, I'd have to say, have a tendency to be a little bit wooden, and you don't really identify with them all that much. I guess my problem is I don't identify a terrible heck of a lot with any one particular character in this film, and the character is sort of the setting, if anything. The setting of the town of Seattle at the time and the people making their way through it and their ambitions and their relationships. It's a really, really nice, wholesome, while still being unflinching. I think I've already said that once, 30 seconds ago. Sort of look at this level of development in a person's life. And that was his intention. His intention was to sort of keep growing up with his writing. And this was the sort of age group of people that were in high school at Fast Times having moved on. Not the characters, obviously. It's a completely different setting and set of characters. Now, back to the early 80s. He actually moved on from Fast Times to a movie people don't remember much about called The Wildlife. And it had Chris Penn, it had Leah Thompson, it had Rick Moranis, it had Lee Ving from the band Fear. It actually also had Eric Stoltz, who was in Fast Times at Ridgemont High, and after that movie had a deal with Cameron Crowe that Cameron agreed to put him into any other film he made, as often as Eric wanted to. So in Singles, he ends up being the loudest, most obnoxious character in the film. Ironically, a mime smoking in the back of a car in a cab on the way home from one of the clubs. Great scene. He absolutely steals it, and you didn't even know it was him for a long time until you paid enough attention to the credits after maybe your third or fourth or fifth viewing. Another really interesting fact about that movie, The Wildlife, is that the soundtrack was mostly comprised of works by one Eddie Van Halen. And for the first time, I've noticed another credit there. Another composer on the soundtrack listed is Alain Johannes. Now, Alain Johannes was actually a teenager at the time. He was in a band in the early 80s with one Jack Irons and one Hillel Slovak. Those names might sound familiar. If they don't sound familiar, well, the band eventually lost their bassist and replaced him with a guy named Flea, who was a friend of Hillel Slovak's. That sound familiar? Yes. So eventually that band breaks up and goes on to become the Red Hot Chili Peppers. I guess Red Hot Chili Peppers. There's no the. Much like Ramones, Misfits, etc. I think Rolling Stones, there's no the, even though we put it there. We can't help ourselves. Did I say I think the Rolling Stones? Anyways, I should have my badge taken away. So Alain Johannes goes on from there to form a band called 11 around 1990 with Jack Irons again, since he at that point is no longer in Red Hot Chili Peppers. After Hillel Slovak overdoses on heroin, Jack Irons leaves the band, and around the time of 88 or so, Mother's Milk is put together by the Chili Peppers, and they have a guy named Chad Smith on drums and a guy named John Frusciante on guitar. That will be where we leave the Chili Peppers for now. We'll pick them up another time. But 11 also has Natasha Snyder. And the three-piece puts out, a few records that get a little bit of traction. Musicians love them more than I think radio did. At one point, they were on tour with Soundgarden, who found out that they 11 didn't have money to put themselves on tour. And Soundgarden loved the band so much that they decided to pay out of pocket for 11's touring expenses, just to have them with them. This is around the time of, I know it was Super Unknown or Post Super Unknown. One of the standout tracks on Super Unknown, that album by Soundgarden, was Spoon Man. Spoon Man started out with that 7/4 time signature riff as an acoustic tune that Chris Cornell had recorded for Singles, and it appears in a little transitional scene where music flyers are being put up with a staple gun onto telephone poles in Seattle. Is that enough of a Seattle connection for you? Well, if it's not, Alain Johannes would go on after the breakup of 11, when Jack Irons went to play for Pearl Jam for a little while, like a no-code era. He and eventually Natasha would both be members of Queens of the Stone Age's live touring, crew, as well as having played on the albums Lullabies to Paralyze and Era Vulgaris. But Johannes featured pretty strongly on Songs for the Deaf as well, which came out before those two, and featured Dave Grohl on drums, Dave Grohl of Nirvana and the Foo Fighters, also heavily featuring Screaming Trees singer Mark Lanegan, who we'll get more into later. Now, I just jumped from Cameron Crowe's early career to Queens of the Stone Age to Screaming Trees, Nirvana, Soundgarden, etc. That's not even the beginning of the tip of the iceberg of the main course of the meal that we haven't had the appetizer for yet. I'm just trying to get you in the right mindset to appreciate the fundamental interconnectedness of all things, as Douglas Adams would try to reinforce over and over and over. Because the Seattle music scene that is basically portrayed in the movie Singles is a deeply intertwined group of people. It's a big network of isolated folks in what became a very, very huge major city during the time that the interconnected music scene was splintering and breaking apart because of the harsh light that was being cast upon it, and because people grow up and develop problems and bands break up. Deals get signed. Business steps in, and a whole lot of people that, to my shock and surprise, I know I'm very naive, had a lot of chemical dependence issues, were then completely and totally, how should I say, enabled into oblivion. And if I was surprised by that, it's because when I was young, it just seemed like the musicians from Seattle that were getting famous tried to have a better handle on what was happening to them and how they were being portrayed. And they had a lot less reverence for the whole relationship with the music media and journalists and MTV compared to their predecessors, or compared to their heroes in the 70s that had, a lot of whom had a good relationship with the press because, one hand was scratching the other's back at any given time. It was before all the overexposure of the media. They kind of relied on each other in the days of, let's say, Kiss. Of course, notoriously, the music press was mean to Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin and a lot of other bands, but a lot of others still found a way to make that relationship work. Anyway, my point was, I always thought that a lot of the Seattle musicians that were getting notoriety were being smarter about it and were cooler about it and weren't just the same old stereotypes. But it turns out people like Mark Arm from Mudhoney would sort of out themselves later as saying, he had become exactly the parody that he had tried to avoid. He had a stripper girlfriend and a heroin habit and overdosed, more than a few times. Mark Arm from Mudhoney. I never would have guessed that would have been one of the, prime candidates for that sort of near tragedy. I mean, Mark Lanigan from Screaming Trees, when you read about what he did, Lane Staley from Alice in Chains, you kind of see that destructive tendency and that sort of isolated willfulness being exuded by the way they carried themselves and the lyrics they wrote. Isn't to say that sums up anything about their character. It's just one of those things that when you kind of hear that they lived a little darker than others, you kind of went, all right, yeah, that seems on brand. Anyways, they weren't freaking Henry Rollins is what I'm saying. To wrap up with Elaine Johannes and his connection to other Seattle musicians, he played on Chris Cornell's Euphoria Morning, and then eventually in Them Crooked Vultures with Dave Grohl and Josh Homme, and then John Paul Jones of Led Zeppelin. There's a big whole story on him in a documentary I have not watched yet. I'm kind of scared it's going to make me very, very sad, but the man's been around a long time. Check out some of his stuff. He's been in a million different projects, and he's you could do worse than checking out the Mark Lanigan solo album Bubblegum and the song Driving Death Valley Blues if you like yourself some lap steel guitar playing through fuzz pedals. But anyway, he's not a Seattle guy. Let's talk about some Seattle folks. Let's talk about some Melvinses and some Soundgardens and some Nirvanas. And let's talk about maybe some Tads and some Mudhoneys and Alice in Chainsies and a whole bunch of other wacky characters that are going to be drifting in and out of each other's transoms from time to time throughout, I don't know, the 5 hours worth of Seattle rock history I want to talk about when covering the movie Singles. No, I'm actually not going to talk about 5 hours worth of Seattle rock history. I will be old and very, very dead if I took all the time I wanted to for that kind of thing. And we'll get deeper into the movie as well. Let's talk about some more interconnectedness, fundamental of all things. It's 1988. A young man named Ben Shepherd has been regularly sneaking onto the ferry from Bainbridge Island to downtown Seattle and going to see shows at places like the Central Saloon in Pioneer Square, above which resides the offices of one Susan Silver, who is Soundgarden's manager and Chris Cornell's soon-to-be wife. He was even at Guerrilla Gardens in 1985 when Soundgarden played their first really professional-style gig opening for the touring Husker Du. Since he's so low on cash and he's so young, he basically has to hitchhike rides home to Bainbridge Island from downtown Seattle after these gigs he's been going to. And he's been playing in some bands himself. Now, if you're not from the area, which I assume you maybe aren't, I don't know if you're one of the, 7 people that will listen to this ever that's not from Seattle, but the idea of being alone in Seattle and Pioneer Square when the bars are closing and trying to get all the way to Bainbridge Island by hitchhiking is kind of a nightmare. Only a young person with nothing to lose and nothing else going on in their life would be doing this on the regular. Anyway, Shepherd's been playing in some punk bands like March of Crimes, 600 School, and Mind Circus. And then his old friend Chad Channing, who was Nirvana's drummer at the time, invites Ben Shepherd to a party in Olympia with Nirvana, where Shepherd ends up hanging out on the couch with one Kurt Cobain for quite a while, and them being sort of kindred spirits and that they're quiet, soft-spoken loners, they hit it off. Eventually, Cobain offers Ben Shepherd a spot as a touring guitarist in Nirvana. Close to this time, he also runs into Kim Thayil, guitarist for Soundgarden, at a Pere Ubu concert. Pere Ubu is a band that we'll get into when I touch on some of the post-punk stuff. I have not yet decided which movies I'm going to connect to Pere Ubu, but we'll see. Maybe Liquid Sky, not to be confused with Vanilla Sky, which I think is another Cameron Crowe film. Anyway, Kim Thayil tells Ben Shepherd that their bass player, Hiro Yamamoto, is going to be out of the band. And they want to carry on with a new bassist and ask if Ben will do it, even though he's a guitar player and isn't known for playing bass. He's 20 years old at this point and wasn't really prepared for that kind of a thing. He got short notice to get all the stuff he could learn under his belt for the songs they've been planning on touring under for Louder Than Love, and they jam together, and he gets on well with everybody, and they decide he's probably the right guy for the job. First, though, he's got to go on tour with Nirvana, and he thinks he's going to be their lead guitar player. Turns out he rehearsed and learned a lot of their songs from Nevermind, but they were mostly just playing shows with songs from Bleach, their debut album, and wanted to kind of keep the other stuff under their hats for the time being. And turns out Shepherd only is going to play with Nirvana one time during a sound check on the first stop of the tour in Minneapolis, and then he will be put in charge of selling t-shirts for them for the rest of the tour. Anyway, since he was not Nirvana's new lead guitarist after that experience, he was free to solidify his place in Soundgarden. They definitely had some trust built up with him already because they knew he grew up around Bainbridge Island and knew Andrew Wood and his brother Kevin Wood from Malfunction, and eventually Mother Love Bone soon after this. Chris Cornell would be roommates with Andy Wood for a little while before he eventually died from a heroin overdose. And we'll get more into that later because the Wood brothers and their exploits will be a big cornerstone for a lot of the history we're going to be talking about. Basically, it's going to come down to the seeds planted by Green River and, Mother Love Bone and Mudhoney and Nirvana and Tad and Melvins, and then things tend to blossom outward from there. Although those seeds, you could say, were laid by bands that came before them, like the U-Men, But time will tell how deep I can get into all of that wonderfulness before we peter out of energy here. There are so many players in this game. There are so many little pieces of webbing in this network. It's crazy. I haven't even started. We haven't even talked about Melvins yet. We haven't talked about the Music Bank. We haven't talked about the rest of the making of singles even. We haven't got into Sub Pop and Jonathan Poneman and Bruce Pavitt, who are sort of the architects for a lot of what's about to happen in these stories. Whether you like it or not. I mean, it's sort of like the history of the American West class I took once, where the teacher had to basically scare some people away if he could at the very beginning by letting us all know that this class is basically going to reinforce the fact that cowboys did not create the American West or settle the American West, or were not responsible for it being what it was and becoming what it was. It was the government, the U.S. government with lots of money, that made the American West happen. They were the ones that were responsible for a lot of white settlers taking land away from the indigenous people and clearing those indigenous people away from the land, and then getting the railroads built, diverting a lot of a lot of water toward Southern California, even though it had no right to be there. And Los Angeles had no real right to exist. Anyway, the parallel I'm drawing is Sub Pop Records. They decided how they were going to spin the narrative of the Seattle scene more than anybody else did. And they were more instrumental in it than anybody else was, for the amount of influence that they had with coming from such sort of small amounts of resources. They were dangling by a string and about to go belly up when Nirvana's record deal got purchased by Geffen. They were the ones that somehow got Mudhoney over to Europe to play the Berlin Independence Festival in 1988 before the band could even book a U.S. tour. Eddie Vedder had heard of Green River when he was still like a surf bum in San Diego and got a demo tape from Mookie Blaylock. Actually, I forget if they were called Mookie Blaylock at that time, or if they got that name when Eddie joined the band. I'll have to correct that later on in the second, third, or fourth episode I'm basing off of my singles review. Do you see how this works? I start talking about a movie and then just go into band stories. So he didn't even know who Mother Love Bone was. That is an indication of how good Sub Pop was at marketing their bands. Green River had, broken up before they really got any steam going on sort of a national level. Mother Love Bone had a deal with A&M Records and was poised to become like the new sort of Guns N' Roses of the 90s. But Eddie Vedder didn't really know about them as much as he did Green River. And then he heard the demo tape from the guys in what was to be Pearl Jam and wrote the lyrics to those three songs, came up to Seattle, got brought into the whole scene, and sort of, wedged in with all these great, nice people that were looking for someone to help continue on this energy that they didn't want to lose after Mother Love Bone had sort of fallen apart. Before all of that stuff even came close to happening, we can go back to 1983, while future Mudhoney bassist Matt Lukin was co-founder of the Melvins, and while he was still in high school. And they went from playing Hendrix covers to playing hardcore punk. But then when Dale Crowe, who would be their main drummer from then on for the history of the band, joined up, they got slower and heavier, which was sort of the key to what their sound was really going to become. The Melvins then temporarily broke up in 87, and I think it was when Buzzo moved to San Francisco at that time for a little while. But at that time, Matt goes and joins Mudhoney. Their drummer, Dan Peters, had not only played with Mudhoney, but he also was in Nirvana after Chad Channing left and before David Grohl joined. He's the drummer that you hear on Sliver from Incesticide. Grandma, Take Me Home. He's the one drummer that was there for that little short period of time. Then he played in Screaming Trees on their early, more attention-grabbing albums before Mudhoney's Steve Turner was ready to reform the band and get it all back together after he'd sort of forced them to take a break so he could go to college. And then Matt would also go on to play in bands like the Fastbacks and in the late 90s-ish, Love Battery, which at one time featured Bruce Fairweather, lead guitarist from Mother Love Bone, on back in 1992-ish. By the way, Mudhoney's sort of commercial peak might have been in the early 90s when, I mean, at least maybe not commercial as far as their record sales or whatever. I couldn't, I don't really know off the top of my head. But as far as national exposure, they had a song on the soundtrack to With Honors in the early 90s, which was a Brendan Fraser movie with Joe Pesci playing a street person and who sort of counsels Brendan Fraser and his college friends about how to write a thesis about America. And I think that was the one where they had a song called Run, Shithead, Run. Let me check that really quick, because I think they were just told that you're going to have a song that plays while somebody's running. And I'm confirming that now, having just done a quick search just to remind myself. And they were also featured in the movie that wasn't Tommy Boy. That movie is Black Sheep with Chris Farley and David Spade. And they do the old, the rock show people don't catch the big fat guy when he jumps off the stage into the crowd so he can go crowd surfing gag that was everywhere in the 90s and a little bit after that. And again, the Ghostbusters reboot in 2016. Anyways, that's two mentions of the Ghostbusters reboot. Now, I think we are done ever mentioning that film for the duration of all of the History of Rock and Roll podcast episodes that I'll be doing, because I can't think of any other way that it ties in. Hey, just to cut in and make some corrections and clarifications for my own sake and my own ego, it is pronounced Jeff Ament. That's Pearl Jam, Mother Love Bone, and Green River's bass player's name. It was actually, I forgot to mention, Jack Irons, who gave the initial 3-song demo tape from the fellas in Pearl Jam to his friend, Eddie Vedder, to maybe try putting some vocals on, which he did, of course. And that tape was evidently, titled Stone Gossard Demos 91, as in 1991, when they were laid down, without a band name. Eddie Vedder would record his vocals and return a tape to the band with the word, or the title, Mama-san, M-A-M-A-S-A-N. Soon after, he ends up coming up to Seattle, going down into their rehearsal studio, banging out some songs with the band, and they played their first show at the Off-Ramp in Seattle. At that time, I believe, named Mookie Blaylock. The band named Mookie Blaylock, not the Off-Ramp in Seattle. I think that'll do it for this introduction to this part of the series of what will be one of our first jumps forward in time in the history of rock and roll in film and rock and roll series. Because what I'm planning on doing is releasing this along with some Jerry Lee Lewis, some Elvis, and maybe a CBGB episode. But then I'm going to have to sort of backtrack to fill in some of the gaps in rockabilly and maybe some punk and maybe some new wave, but we'll get to that later. I'm going to say goodbye for now and just remind you that rock and roll is the greatest, and we should all be thankful for how much of it we got so far. Have a good one. Talk to you soon. No, we won't.